Greetings, folks, and welcome to our fourth and final little talk on Wuthering Heights. What I think I'd like to do today mostly is to focus on Heathcliff and how his story plays out. He is the most compelling and the most troubling character in the novel, and one of the most compelling and one of the most troubling characters, I think, in all of English literature. At least, I've always found him to be both of those things. What I think I'll do as well, just to keep my tendency to ramble under control, because of course it would be possible to just talk about this book by itself all term, I think, is focus on just a few specific passages and not deviate too far from those. Read the passages and then see what they reveal when we start looking at them closely. The first passage I'd like to look at is a conversation between Heathcliff and Nellie in chapter 29. It's set at the Heights, and Katherine has just finished expressing her contempt for Heathcliff as a loveless and unloved individual whom she would never want to be. All of which is very fair considering their relationship, and that Heathcliff has been monstrously abusive toward her, both psychologically and physically. We'll pick it up after Katherine has made her exit, and where Heathcliff turns to confide in Nellie. He turned abruptly to the fire and continued, with what, for lack of a better word, I must call a smile. "I'll tell you what I did yesterday. I got the sexton, who was digging Linton's grave, to remove the earth off her coffin lid, and I opened it. I thought once I would have stayed there when I saw her face again. It's hers yet. He had hard work to stir me, but he said it would change if the air blew on it. And so I struck one side of the coffin loose and covered it up. Not Linton's side, damn him. I wish he'd been soldered in lead. And I bribed the sexton to pull it away when I'm laid there and slide mine out too. I'll have it made so, and then, by the time Linton gets to us, he'll not know which is which." "You were very wicked, Mr. Heathcliff," I exclaimed. "Were you not ashamed to disturb the dead?" "I disturbed nobody, Nellie," he replied. "And I gave some ease to myself. I shall be a great deal more comfortable now, and you'll have a better chance of keeping me underground when I get there. Disturb her? No. She has disturbed me night and day through 18 years, incessantly, remorselessly, till yesternight. And yesternight I was tranquil. I dreamt I was sleeping the last sleep by that sleeper, with my heart stopped and my cheek frozen against hers. And if she had been dissolved into earth, or worse, what would you have dreamt of then?" I said. "Of dissolving with her, and of being more happy still," he answered. "Do you suppose I dread any change of that sort? I expected such a transformation on raising the lid, but I'm better pleased that it should not commence till I share it. Besides, unless I had received a distinct impression of her passionless features, that strange feeling would hardly have been removed. It began oddly. You know, I was wild after she died, and eternally, from dawn till dawn, praying her to return to me, her spirit. I have a strong faith in ghosts. I have a conviction that they can and do exist among us. The day she was buried, there came a fall of snow. In the evening I went to the churchyard. It blew, bleak as winter. All round was solitary. I didn't feel that her fool of a husband would wander up the den so late, and no one else had business to bring them there. Being alone and conscious 2 yards of loose earth was the sole barrier between us, I said to myself, I'll have her in my arms again. If she be cold, I'll think it is this north wind that chills me, and if she be motionless, it is sleep. I got a spade from the tool house and began to delve with all my might. It scraped the coffin. I fell to work with my hands. The wood commenced cracking about the screws. I was on the point of attaining my object, when it seemed that I heard a sigh from someone above, close at the edge of the grave, and bending down. "If I can only get this off," I muttered. "I wish they may shovel the earth over us both." And I wrenched at it more desperately still. There was another sigh close at my ear. I appeared to feel the warm breath of it displacing the sleet-laden wind. I knew no living thing in flesh and blood was by, but as certainly as you perceive the approach of some substantial body in the dark, though it cannot be discerned, so certainly I felt that Kathy was there, not under me, but on the earth. A sudden sense of relief flowed from my heart through every limb. I relinquished my labor of agony and turned consoled at once, unspeakably consoled. Her presence was with me. It remained while I refilled the grave and led me home. You may laugh if you will, but I was sure I should see her there. I was sure she was with me, and I could not help talking to her. Having reached the heights, I rushed eagerly to the door. It was fastened, and I remember that accursed Earnshaw and my wife exposed my entrance. I remember stopping to kick the breath out of him, and then hurrying upstairs to my room and hers. I looked round impatiently. I felt her by me. I could almost see her, and yet I could not. I ought to have sweat blood then from the anguish of my yearning, from the fervor of my supplications to have but one glimpse. I had not one. She showed herself, as she often was in life, a devil to me. And since then, sometimes more and sometimes less, I've been the sport of that intolerable torture, infernal, keeping my nerves at such a stretch that if they had not resembled catgut, they would, long ago, have relaxed to the feebleness of Lintons. When I sat in the house with Hareton, it seemed that on going out I should meet her. When I walked on the moors, I should meet her coming in. When I went from home, I hastened to return. She must be somewhere at the heights, I was certain. And when I slept in her chamber, I was beaten out of that. I couldn't lie there for the moment. I closed my eyes. She was either outside the window, or sliding back the panels, or entering the room, or even resting her darling head on the same pillow as she did when a child. And I must open my lids to see. And so I opened and closed them 100 times a night, to be always disappointed. It racked me. I've often groaned aloud till that old rascal Joseph no doubt believed that my conscience was playing a fiend inside of me. Now, since I've seen her, I'm pacified a little. It was a strange way of killing, not by inches, but by fractions of hairbreadths, to beguile me with the spectre of a hope through 18 years. I've always loved this passage. Among other things, it kind of brings us back to the notion that we discussed the other day of being perfectly matched with another person. The notion that the character Aristophanes puts forward in Plato's Symposium. Heathcliff's desire is for union with and complete dissolution in Cathy, in everything that is Cathy. He acknowledges and can tolerate no boundary between the two of them, and of course arranges for there to be no boundary between the two of them. His arrangement, of course, offends Nellie's parochial sensibilities, and presumably would be at least a little bit surprising, maybe even shocking, to a contemporary, that is to say, Victorian reader. For all I know, it may seem a little weird to some of you. But it's perfectly consistent with the words and actions of Cathy and Heathcliff relative to each other. Remember Cathy's wonderful exclamation, "I am Heathcliff." There is a mutual recognition of a mutual or joint being, I suppose, on both their parts. And the arrangement that Heathcliff works out with the sexton is simply the concrete acknowledgement of what they both actually have recognized, and what in a sense Heathcliff has quite torturously been living with for the last 18 years. As he says, Cathy has haunted him, and this has to be understood as really happening within the novel, not as Heathcliff being just a little crazy, because of course, as we discussed in the first talk, Heathcliff's and Lockwood's experiences confirm each other. But of course, love isn't always nice, is it? And what we see between Cathy and Heathcliff is, well, I've seen it described as elemental, something that simply doesn't fit the comfortable categories that society, that civilization imposes. And there's an interesting comparison I think we can make if we look back to that scene in which Edgar is pressing himself down on Cathy's grave towards the end of his own life. Edgar, of course, being the civilized one, but the one also not moved by the depth of passion that Heathcliff has. He'll throw himself down on her grave. Heathcliff will climb down into the grave with her. And while that may seem a little weird, There is no question about who has the stronger and the more visceral drive to be with Kathy. Heathcliff is not constrained by common notions of decency, piety, limitations, restraint. He reminds me, and I think we're maybe supposed to have this in mind, of the plants from the moor creeping over the crumbled wall of the churchyard toward Kathy's grave. There's a natural force or a psychological force here that is, I would say, actually both pre-rational and amoral, and probably amoral because pre-rational. There is, of course, by Nellie's standard, the standard of conventional society, something quite monstrous about Heathcliff. Not only something monstrous, something that her worldview does not equip her to understand. I think that's more important. Because, of course, we don't understand monsters. They're monstrous because we don't understand them. If we could understand them, we could fit them into nice, neat categories, and then they wouldn't be monsters anymore. And Nellie does try to fit Heathcliff into one of her nice, neat categories. It just doesn't go too well. It's very obvious from Heathcliff's response that her categories are utterly irrelevant to him. They're a projection onto him. They are, in other words, at best, an unwelcome imposition, and one that lacks any force, intellectual, social, moral. That is, Nellie's standards regarding Heathcliff are really just kind of absurd. And Heathcliff, on the other hand, though operating kind of at an emotional extreme, is actually speaking quite accurately. He believes in ghosts, and it would appear that Emily did too. And while Nellie says he's disturbing the dead, Heathcliff quite sensibly says, no, I didn't disturb anything. Because what he was so-called disturbing was not conscious. So he's simply approaching his understanding of dead bodies from a different frame of reference than what Nellie is. And his symbolism, or his interpretation of dead bodies, is rooted in his own relationship to who that body was and to his understanding of a relationship that is not completed yet and that will continue. And in light of which Nellie's conventional piety is, as I said, really just kind of an annoying interference. The other long passage I'd like to look at occurs in chapter 34, and this is Nellie recounting the last days of Heathcliff, that period when he's psychologically detached himself from his surroundings, lost for all purposes all interest in the people around him, and in tormenting them any further, and is periodically seen to be gazing at something just a few steps away that no one else can see. And we'll pick it up with Nellie. I distinguished Mr. Heathcliff's step, restlessly measuring the floor, and he frequently broke the silence by a deep inspiration resembling a groan. He muttered detached words also. The only one I could catch was the name of Katherine, coupled with some wild terms of endearment or suffering, and spoken as one would speak to a person present, low and earnest, and wrung from the depth of his soul. I had not the courage to walk straight into the apartment, but I desired to divert him from his reverie, and therefore fell foul of the kitchen fire, stirred it, and began to scrape the cinders. It drew him forth sooner than I expected. He opened the door immediately and said, "Nellie, come here. Is it morning? Come in with your light." "It is striking 4, I answered. "You want a candle to take upstairs? You might have lit one at this fire." "No, I don't wish to go upstairs," he said. "Come in, and kindle me a fire, and do anything there is to do about the room." "I must blow the coals red first, before I can carry any," I replied, getting a chair and the bellows. He roamed to and fro meantime, in a state approaching distraction, his heavy sighs succeeding each other, so thick as to leave no space for common breathing between. "When day breaks, I'll send for Green," he said. "I wish to make some legal inquiries of him, while I can bestow a thought on those matters, and while I can act calmly. I have not written my will yet, and how to leave my property I cannot determine. I wish I could annihilate it from the face of the earth." "I would not talk so, Mr. Heathcliff," I interposed. "Let your will be a while. You'll be spared to repent of your many injustices yet. I never expected that your nerves would be disordered. They are, at present, marvelously so, however, and almost entirely through your own fault. The way you've passed these 3 last days might knock up a Titan. Do take some food and some repose. You need only look at yourself in a glass to see how you require both. Your cheeks are hollow, your eyes bloodshot, like a person starving with hunger and going blind with loss of sleep." "It's not my fault that I cannot eat or rest," he replied. "I assure you it's through no settled designs. I'll do both as soon as I possibly can, but you might as well bid a man struggling in water rest within arm's length of the shore. I must reach it first, and then I'll rest. Well, never mind, Mr. Green. As to repenting of my injustices, I've done no injustice, and I repent of nothing. I'm too happy, and yet I'm not happy enough. My soul's bliss kills my body, but does not satisfy itself." "Happy, master?" I cried. "Strange happiness. If you could hear me without being angry, I might offer some advice that would make you happier." "What's that?" he asked. "Give it." "You are aware, Mr. Heathcliff," I said, "that from the time you were 13 years old you have lived a selfish, unchristian life, and probably hardly had a Bible in your hands during all that period. You must have forgotten the contents of the book, and you may not have space to search it now. Could it be hurtful to send for someone, some minister of any denomination, it does not matter which, to explain it, and show you how very far you have erred from its precepts, and how unfit you will be for its heaven unless a change takes place before you die?" "I'm rather obliged than angry, Nellie," he said, "for you remind me of the manner that I desire to be buried in. It is to be carried to the churchyard in the evening. You and Hareton may, if you please, accompany me, and mind, particularly, to notice that the sexton obeys my directions concerning the 2 coffins. No ministers need come, nor need anything be said over me. I tell you I have nearly attained my heaven, and that of others is altogether unvalued and uncoveted by me." And there's a lot going on here, isn't there? The parallel to Kathy's dream of being thrown out of heaven and then crying for joy when she reaches the moor is probably the first thing that's going to jump to most of your minds. Another is the really obvious tension between worldviews, again, where Heathcliff and Nellie are concerned, and Nellie functioning here, as always, as the voice of convention. And as far as that goes, there's one little detail I would like to focus on. She mentions that he doesn't have much time, so he could have someone explain the Bible to him and explain how he is falling short of it. This introduces another layer to the discussion on the various spiritualities lurking in the novel. We've already established, of course, that Kathy and Heathcliff are aligned with the spirituality of the Moor, the spirituality that rejects walls, rejects containers. And in that sense, well, this is another way we can actually look at Heathcliff striking the side of Kathy's coffin off, isn't it? Rejecting their separate containment, or rejecting attempts to contain them, physically, and I think even symbolically or mythically. But insofar as Nellie's religion is something that's imposed on the land, and imposed on the people who live there, largely by her, or in its cranky version by Joseph. Here she's attempting to get him not to submit to the authority of her own sacred text, but to someone else's interpretation of the authority of her own sacred text, even less direct, even less compelling. Whereas Heathcliff is in direct communication, we've just seen, with the sacred as he understands it, with his divinity. Why the hell would he need some yahoo to tell him about some book that supposedly describes somebody else's version of the divine when he's fucking talking to it every day from his point of view? So Nellie in this case comes across as completely absurd. But this also brings us around to the question of inscription or overwriting, doesn't it? Which we've been talking about since Jane Eyre. Right to the end, Nellie is trying to contain Heathcliff to his face, to contain his character, but also trying to contain the interpretation of Heathcliff for Lockwood, and therefore for us. And this is also really important to bear in mind. Nellie speaks from a point of view that's generally, as I said, conventional in her society, and that attempts to contain everything. And yet Heathcliff's character, particularly when looked at from its own terms, simply cannot be contained by the narrative that Nellie proposes, by the discursive walls that she tries to build around it. Heathcliff remains to the end, for Nellie, I think, completely incomprehensible, because she insists on trying to comprehend him on her own terms. And her terms are comfortable, and they have a long history behind them, and they seem to work pretty well in keeping society together. They're just, in this case, wrong. Or maybe a better term is utterly inadequate to the task of understanding. And when we recognize the inadequacy of Nellie's terms, I think even if we don't share Nellie's terms, we have to recognize, at least potentially, the inadequacy of our own. From how many positions have we, over the course of the novel, judged or tried to judge Heathcliff? I mean, speaking as a reader, I've known the guy for 38 years, and I still find much of what he does repellent. So when I speak of the difficulty of containing him, I'm not speaking from a position of personally justifying his actions. But I do find his claim that he has nothing to repent interesting. Repentance, of course, is a religious concept that has no place in Heathcliff's psyche. But one thing that does have a place in his psyche is a conception of justice. And he says, I have done no injustice. Well, what does he mean by that? Because, of course, by most conceptions of justice operating in his own society, and I think operating in ours, he has. He has actively destroyed 2 families. He's been physically and psychologically abusive, as I said. I mean, hell, he used his own son as nothing more than a placeholder for his own authority so that he could get someone else's land. So whatever conception of justice that Heathcliff is appealing to, it is not founded on human well-being. So what is it founded on? And here we have to recognize that it is founded on something, simply because there has been a consistency to Heathcliff's character. He has remained true to his convictions, particularly his commitment to Kathy, even when she broke her commitment to him, or at least didn't remain true to him, in ways that I think they both recognized at the end. That is, as I think I mentioned a couple of talks ago, Heathcliff lives in a moral world of 2, the other one being Kathy. That's the extent of his morality, the extent of his horizons where anything resembling justice is concerned. But as I say that, I realize I'm wrong, because, of course, Heathcliff does execute justice, doesn't he? His destruction of Hindley is nothing but justice, as are his machinations in getting the Linton patrimony. And this actually brings us to some rather troubling theological ground, doesn't it? Because he takes his revenge not merely on the individuals who offended him, and particularly in Hindley's case, mistreated him very, very badly, but he also takes it out on their children. And we might think, well, that's profoundly unjust by any reasonable measure, and I would concur. It is. The children of the offending parties shouldn't have to pay for the crimes of the offending parties, even assuming that there is a debt for them to pay, and we'll grant that just for the sake of discussion. But if children don't inherit their parents' guilt, if that moral guilt is not transferable from one to another, well, then there's a serious problem with Christianity too, isn't there? Because there goes original sin. That is, Heathcliff is acting in this sense, I think, in a way comparable to the way in which Nellie's God acts regarding all of humanity, which inherited this sin of Adam and Eve, which nobody was around to actually commit. So either guilt is transmissible or transferable generationally, or it's not. If it is, Heathcliff has not done anything wrong. And if it's not, there's a serious problem with Nellie's theology. But as long as we're on the topic of mythologies, there is another that I'd like to introduce that I haven't mentioned so far, and with which I expect many of Bronte's readers would certainly be familiar. Bronte herself was, definitely. And that is, of course, Greek mythology, or if you prefer, Greco-Roman mythology. And there are a couple of verbal clues here to suggest that this is what Bronte wants us to do. Nellie refers to Heathcliff's patterns over the last few days as being enough to, as she puts it, knock up a Titan. And earlier on, towards the end of chapter 31, Heathcliff is described as being Saturnine. So within a relatively short space, we have two sort of oblique references to the Titans. Saturn, of course, being the Roman name for Kronos, father of Zeus, or Jupiter in Rome. So here we need to think of the various generations of the gods, don't we? The Titans are, of course, the generation prior to the Olympians, and they're very different in their own nature. They're not quite as raw as the almost amorphous original gods, but they are primal, they're chthonic, they're much less rational or rationalized than the Olympians themselves. They embody more primitive, more deeply buried urges maybe, or more deeply rooted forces, less subject to rational control and less subject to rational explanation. For a complete account of this, of course, you should read Hesiod's Theogony, which isn't terribly long. But why are we bringing this up? And, well, maybe the best way I have of answering that question is to take a look at one of my favorite paintings and go from there. This is Goya's Saturn devouring his son, showing the scene where, well, part of the scene, I suppose, where Saturn, or Kronos, devours the entire generation of his children to prevent them usurping his power. And to be clear, I'm not trying to cite this as a source for Heathcliff or anything, or to suggest that Bronte ever saw this painting. I think it would be highly unlikely if she ever did. But it does sort of remind me of Heathcliff's virtual consumption of Linton, and more broadly of the difference in the natures between the second and third generations, between the Cathy, Heathcliff, Edgar generation and the Katherine, Hareton, Linton generation. This for a long time has reminded me of the differences between the two generations of the gods in Greek mythology. The Olympians are much more rational, and the Titans both deeper and darker, I think. And the process, of course, continues as you move into the younger generation of the Olympians themselves. They become gradually more specialized, gradually more compartmentalized, and simultaneously their horizons a little bit narrower. One of the ways we can read the Titans psychologically, anyway, is as those deeply buried urges and impulses that are, whether we like it or not, part of our character, but that very often have no civil outlet, that they must be contained, controlled, disguised, moderated in order to fit into a functioning society, or even a functioning psyche that can get along in a functioning society. As much as one might not like Zeus, and as much as the Olympian gods often come across as being capricious, as a group, they do politics. They do tend toward consensus, even though some of them may go grumbling all the way. And I'm looking at you, Poseidon. That is, they are on the whole, as gods go, very civil. The Titans aren't. The Titans have their own interests. Very much like Kathy and Heathcliff, they just have their own interests, and those interests tend to be fairly straightforward and not really blended with a whole lot else. And this is also true of Hindley, of course, and Francis, and also to a degree, I think, of Edgar and Isabella. The Lintons are the civil side of things, but there's also a deficiency in them in that they don't really get the world outside the walls. That is, they might be a little too civilized. And I think this is a nice way of reading the younger generation, who are all explicitly blendings of the traits of their lineages, as you would expect, of course, just because that's how children work, but the attention that Bronte draws to that blending does, I think, point to a qualitative shift in character between the second and third generations. Katherine and Hareton are not as compelling as Kathy and Heathcliff. They don't have that wildness, they don't have that energy, but they can function. Their relationship looks kind of like a normal, healthy relationship, except for one little detail, and that is, of course, that they're first cousins, and Kathy is also first cousins with Linton. This also strikes me, by the way, as being rather godlike. The gods marry their siblings and cousins all the time simply because they're the only ones around. Well, the society that we're shown in Wuthering Heights is a very small society. There aren't that many options. So, once again, this looks, as I've said before, like a novel, but I think it actually can be read more profitably as a myth, just dressed as a novel. But if it's a myth, what does it account for? What process does it illustrate? What insight does it give? What does it explain? Because these are all things that myths do. Not all myths all of the time, of course, but this is one, or these are some of their functions. And I think there is an answer to that. It's to this answer that I'll turn in the final little bit of the talk. So let's just take a few minutes to think about how things end up, what this says about what we might call, I guess, the spiritual geography of the novel, and the vision of life such as it is moving forward from the conclusion. And one thing I keep coming back to every time I approach this novel is that it ends with much narrower horizons than those with which it begins. I think I mentioned in the first talk that the world of the novel can be sketched out roughly as a gradient between the chapel by Gimmerton on the one hand and Penistone Crags at the other extreme, with Thrushcross Grange at the sort of civilized end closer to the chapel, and Wuthering Heights at the uncivilized end up on the moors closer to the crags. At the beginning of the novel, both the Heights and the Grange are occupied. And what this suggests to me anyways, and I do read this very symbolically, you'll excuse me if I go a little overboard, I hope, but what this suggests to me is that there's a range of human experience, a range of psychological, a range of spiritual experience that is open, that's available at the beginning of the novel, that actually is not available or not open at the end. The Heights are going to be closed down. Joseph, by the very end, is up there by himself just tending the place, and when he's gone to his maker or gone to the ground or wherever the hell he goes, the place is just going to be boarded up. So the human access to certain parts of the world has contracted drastically by the end of the novel, so that it is utterly contained by the civil, by the walls of the Grange, for example. So therefore also by the ideology, by the worldview that the Grange embodies, the worldview, the ideology that makes walls. The freedom of the moors is lost. The spirituality of Kathy weeping for joy when she lands back on the heath because she doesn't belong in heaven, that's gone. I see that as tragic myself. Yes, Katherine and Hareton are probably going to have a very happy life together. They're going to be married. The houses are reconciled. The fracture that was Heathcliff is healed. But the fracture also is healed because half of the world has been split off. That has been the fracture. And that's a real loss. We're, by the end of the novel, in the worldview of Nellie. And that's it. And to my eyes, that doesn't seem good enough. So in that sense, I do see this, I do read this whole trajectory, actually, even including the pending marriage at the end. And Victorian novels, of course, are famous for ending either with a wedding or a funeral. But I tend to read this as a tragic ending because of its implied loss of that range of human and spiritual experience, that loss of wildness that, yes, is dangerous. We saw that danger with Heathcliff. Heathcliff was the embodiment of that danger. But all experience and all knowledge comes with some risk, comes with some danger, doesn't it? And reading this not merely as a realistic novel, which I don't think it is, but as sort of a myth of human consciousness, then my own subjective reading is that by the end of the book, more is lost than is gained. Stability is gained. Some happiness, of course, for the protagonists of the second half of the book, Katherine and Hareton, certainly it's gained, and that's nice. I like them both. I'm very fond of them as characters. But maybe it's just because I'm a person who's drawn to rocky places and is impatient of walls and constraints. This doesn't strike me as being good enough. And I don't think it strikes Emily as being good enough either, because, of course, there are those rumors, like at the very end of the book, aren't there, of people seeing ghosts up in Penistone Crags, 2 children. So we know that within the world of the novel, Kathy and Heathcliff do get to be together, and that is good. That's the other reconciliation. The split between them is actually healed. And it's not healed in heaven, it's healed here, but it's healed in a part of here that we can no longer go to, or at least that is narratively closed off. I think that's a better way of putting it by the end of the book. Well, why would that be a good thing? And the answer is pretty obvious. That wildness, as I said, is dangerous. But also, the depths of Kathy and Heathcliff's love is dangerous. And I think this is a problem that many thinkers and writers have had over the years. What do you do with love, that most powerful of human emotions? Because when it gets out of control, all hell can break loose. And I wonder, is there an acknowledgement here that these things are real, that emotional experience, that spiritual experience is real, but at the same time, while being real, just can't quite fit into the society, into the vision of society that Victorian England has for itself. And I would say that many modern societies have for themselves. Kathy and Heathcliff are primitive. They're primitive in the way that the Titans are primitive. And they are, as I've mentioned before, in their particular relationship to each other, utterly amoral where anyone else is concerned. Or if we're thinking of them as being primitive, we can maybe think of them as being pre-moral. There's something fundamental, something foundational to the human psyche, I think, at play with Kathy and Heathcliff. And I always have a hard time articulating it. It touches on the sublime, as I was talking with you about the other day. Something that challenges our own comfortable categories, that is too big to be beautiful, and that is, in its way, kind of horrifying, but that you can't ignore, but that intrudes upon your categories. As I've said a couple of times, I think, during this talk and maybe the previous ones, that Kathy and Heathcliff love each other is beyond any doubt. You can't deny that without simply calling the novelist herself a liar about her own book. But what love is to them is, I think, in some ways not what love is permitted to be in a civil society. It's something for which, by its own nature on the one hand, and by the nature of civil society on the other, there's just no room. And there's no room, I think, maybe because civil society might be too small. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. Like, I wrestle with this book all the time. Because I'm always aware, of course, that Heathcliff is a horrible human being. As human beings go, he's a monster. Morally, he's a monster. And yet, at the end of the novel, Emily places him exactly where he wants to be. And she places Kathy exactly where she wants to be and with whom she wants to be. So we can't read this as a simple morality tale. It just doesn't work that way. That would be an imposition on the level of one of Nellie's impositions. It demands that we stand back from our own judgments. And that's hard to do, especially where questions of abuse are concerned. That's really, really hard to do. But that, of course, is also what the monstrous does, isn't it? It challenges our categories. Definitionally, the monstrous always challenges our categories. And I realize as I say this, and I've talked a little bit about monsters and the monstrous in this lecture, that I haven't actually given you a theoretical foundation yet of what I mean by monster and what the monstrous is. So what I think I'm probably going to do for our next talk, which should be the introduction to Tenant of Wildfell Hall, is take some time to lay out what I mean by monster, what I mean by the monstrous, because it doesn't just apply to Wuthering Heights. It has applications elsewhere in the course as well. So I think you might find that kind of useful. I may or may not during that talk refer back to Wuthering Heights. I don't know. It just occurred to me now that I should do that. For the time being, though, I think I should probably wrap this up. I'm not going to try to tie this novel into a nice, neat package. I don't think you would want me to, and I don't think I can. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope you found these talks to be useful. And I also hope, as we move on to Tenant of Wildfell Hall, for which I'd like you to have to the end of Chapter 14 read for next time, that you enjoy that too. Thanks very much for listening. Bye for now.